Hello and welcome back to Slick Talk. This is your host, Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to episode 65, titled Breaking Character. In addition to running the podcast and being a senior analyst at Blackstone, I also do acting on the side. So recently, I wrapped up a run of You Can't Take It With You, which is a Broadway play from back in the day. They produced it in the 30s for the first time. There was a Jimmy Stewart adaptation of the play, so you might know it by the movie. But during the whole run, I kept thinking about the idea of breaking character, specifically not doing it. Something that is tricky to avoid, especially when there's comedy involved. Sometimes the laugh is bigger than you expect. Sometimes the delivery from your fellow actors on stage is just so over the top and hard to ignore. And then other times, something really unexpected happens. Maybe something that is off script, like an entrance is late, or like a prop is dropped, or something out of the blue, you don't see it coming. And that in particular is a scenario where it is so hard not to break character. And just like an actor, believe it or not, engines can break character too, at least from our vantage point. So we will see the results of a particular oil change interval. With any luck, we'll see several oil change intervals, and we'll be able to understand what is the norm for each and every engine we come across. The numbers will speak to how the engine is wearing, hopefully consistently. Ideally, there is an absence of contamination. We'll see numbers that speak to the engine staying in character, handling whatever is thrown its way with ease. That is the ideal scenario as an analyst. When you pull up the data, you want to see results that fit in with what you've seen before. Let's put it that way. In the case of a 2008 F-250 powered by a 6.4-liter Power Stroke, I saw an engine that was breaking character. This was the other day, in fact. We had, I want to say, 15 samples from this particular owner, and they spoke to the engine wearing very well, not making, any more metal than average. We saw an oil that was holding up well. By that, I mean, keeping the appropriate viscosity. We saw, everything from an absence of harmful contamination to low insolubles that spoke to the oil filter holding up well. It all spoke to the engine staying in character. And then we had some notable finds, mainly in the spectral exam. For the uninitiated, the spectral exam is one component of our standard analysis. That's where we find out wear levels, and we find out if there's contamination from coolant or excess dirt. We also get a look at oil additives that are in the particular oil the owner is running. The changes here, the ways in which the engine was breaking character, came in the form of high aluminum, potassium, and we also saw lead higher than both average and the engine's sample history. Veteran listeners of this show might know already where I'm going with aluminum and potassium in particular, especially because this is a diesel. This pairing of elements can be harmless in nature in the form of flux from the intercooler or the EGR. Here's the thing about flux, though. It tends to show up early on in an engine's life. This particular motor was well past the 300,000 mile mark, so wear-in had happened long ago, at least initial wear-in. So while there was the possibility of these elements being flux, we couldn't just assume right out of the gate that's what it was. Now on to lead. We have lead, which is a bearing metal. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's a bearing metal. Now, still, an increase doesn't necessarily translate to an obvious problem. but it was an increase nonetheless and a high level in the end. Important thing to do when you see a breaking character, either on stage or from an engine, is to find out why so it doesn't happen again. Get the background information and understand whether or not you're looking at a problem or whether this was just a flash in the pan, something no one could have seen coming, and, well, it's not necessarily a problem. Fortunately, by way of asking questions and presenting varied explanations that we have accumulated from our years of experience looking at changes like these, we were able to arrive at a conclusion that fortunately didn't speak to this engine being headed for the boneyard. Instead, we learned a story that applied directly to these results. We're presenting the varied explanations to the owner in the report. He was kind enough to email back and fill us in on the details. This particular sample was sent our way after the truck had hit a deer. At least the owner thought it was a deer. They weren't entirely sure. But deer or no deer, there was damage to this truck that called for a replacement of the intercooler. Now, if you were with me paying attention just a few minutes ago, I mentioned that aluminum and potassium in a diesel can be harmless flux, especially early on. But it can show up again if there is a repair or a replacement involving the intercooler or EGR. It's more than reasonable to associate the increases in aluminum and potassium with flux as opposed to poor wear with potassium from coolant, because we didn't have excess sodium that would make it likely that potassium was from coolant reaching the engine oil. Also, the fact that aluminum increased in tandem with potassium. From flux, these elements will normally track together. So we had some very favorable characteristics of this sample in general. Lead from the bearings is a metal we're still going to keep an eye on. It's not from flux. However, when you have repairs and you have an instance where the engine is opened up, you can get high wear from the additional metals that will then improve as the engine is further removed from being opened and has a couple of oil changes under its belt. So we're not going to look at these results and gain a piece of information and simply ignore the remaining possibilities. But the fact is, if an engine runs well, good oil pressure, no unusual noise, you have the caveat of there being a recent repair, and all being well on the owner's end, there is good reason to just check back on these elements at the next oil change and see if the engine returns to giving the performances we've expected previously. Just to keep the acting metaphor going a bit longer, it behooves an actor to ask questions when they're learning their role. Find out the character's motivations, find out what they want out of a scene, a confrontation. Find out exactly what they're there to do. Not just they themselves, the actor, but the character. Well, similarly, a good analyst, in my mind, is one that isn't afraid of asking questions. Because truth be told, while we can provide results, providing the explanation is a different deal entirely, and sometimes requires the analyst to be a little vulnerable and admit that there are numerous explanations at times for certain results and that we want to know more in order to give the customer the best analysis possible. Well-rounded analysis that takes into account the variables, as opposed to just trying to present results, call the levels high, and then leave the owner with the anxiety of figuring it out themselves. A good analyst, like a good actor, asks questions, pulls in all the information so that they can do their best work. I can't help but wonder if other labs or customers that go to other labs, how they feel when they get results. Levels are marked high, and sure enough, in this particular sample, the levels were indeed high. I can't help but wonder how that customer would feel if there was no context given, no acknowledgement of the possible explanations other than the engine simply having a problem, how does that customer feel? Because in my mind, without there being a reasoned explanation of both the harmful and harmless reasons for increases, you're kind of left to your own devices. And I think that can generally just result in an owner maybe wishing they hadn't had their oil analyzed, because now they're put in a position where they have to make sense of these results on their own and also have to wonder, did the lab consider it? Does the lab know that I had a recent repair? Or, here's this particular circumstance where I asked so much of the engine, more than I do previously. It would sure help me sleep better at night knowing that whoever was analyzing the oil I sent in is able to factor in these explanations. Instead of telling the owner that they had an obvious problem, that they needed to go to the shop and the world is ending and thousands of dollars are going to be poured down the drain. No. Instead, with the helpful background info tied in with the results, having the track record, knowing that the engine had broken character for some reason and we want to know why, here's a couple of explanations, and then arriving at a reasonable expectation of there being improvement at the next oil change, well, that's an outcome I can get behind. And if I was that customer, I'd sure feel a whole lot better about the engine, the truck it's powering, and knowing that the lab took interest in pulling in these additional facts. We'll do this with transmissions as well, differentials. Any system that needs oil that does its job can run into instances where something unusual happens. To sum up, I'm reminded of a quote from President of Blackstone Laboratories, Ryan Stark, who once told me, if there's something unusual in the oil, there's a reason. Blackstone, when we find results that take us by surprise, we're just as interested, if not more so at times, I think, than the owner in finding out the why. And if you feel like you might have left something out, either on the slip or you're not sure if you remember something after the fact, after we've already done the report, you can still reach out. Fill us in on the information that you feel might have played a role in the result. You can do that by calling our offices, emailing, reaching out on social media. Let us know if you feel like we might need another piece to the puzzle. We're always open to the additional information. It helps us give you the best report possible. That wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Reminder that if you are listening on a platform that allows you to leave a star rating, please do. I saw recently on Spotify, I can now rate a podcast with a star rating. So if you're listening on Spotify and you haven't thought to do that already, please do. On Apple, we are just one review shy of breaking 70. I kind of want that number. So please do reach out, either give a star rating, but also if you have any sort of comments on the show in general, that's good too. Remember, our survey links on SurveyMonkey are still open if you want to leave topic suggestions for upcoming episodes. We're always open to hearing those. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.